Well, back to our theme for 2025 is live like Jesus, and this comes out of a simple desire to follow Jesus and to learn better what that means. So this part of the study I've called the renewed life because Matthew tells the story of Jesus in a way that highlights the difference that Jesus makes. In case you're just joining us, we are spending the entire year in the Gospel of Matthew, and we're about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through. Over the last several months, we've talked about divine healing, we've talked about deliverance, we've talked about forgiveness, and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. We've talked about faith, repentance, having a personal relationship with God. We looked at the parables of Jesus and his miracles, signs and wonders, which demonstrate both the power of God and the purpose of God to restore all things. So when I last spoke a few weeks ago, we covered the subjects of religion and tradition. Remember, we said that religion should facilitate a relationship with God, but it should never become a substitute for knowing God personally. At the heart of Jesus' teaching and his ministry is personal and spiritual transformation, and that's our subject for today. We know that Jesus' purpose is to restore the world and everything in it. So tradition and religion tend to focus on the outward changes, but transformation is about the inward change that we experience when we live like Jesus. Now that word transformation, the Bible uses a word, and you probably recognize it, metamorphosis. You all heard that word before? Yeah. It speaks of a total transformation from the inside out. And it's the same word that Paul uses when he says in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect." Now, I'm sure most of you have heard this before, but I can't think of a better illustration than a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Remember this from high school science class or maybe elementary school science class? When did you guys learn this? Was it elementary school? Kindergarten. You learned it already in kindergarten? My goodness, kids are getting smarter these days. So a caterpillar consumes a large quantity of leaves for weeks or even months to store up energy as it grows to full size. And when it's full grown, it attaches itself to a surface like a branch, and then it forms a protective covering around it. That's called, what is it called? Yeah, you had this already in kindergarten. You must know this by now. A chrysalis, right, yeah. And then, do you know what happens next? The caterpillar's body digests itself. Ew. Until it becomes like this soupy substance, and its body is completely broken down into a liquid form. And then there's these special cells called imaginal discs that know the design of what it is to become. And they begin to form that soup-like substance into legs and a body and a new structure with wings like a butterfly. And this process can last from a few days up to a few weeks. And then the newly formed butterfly emerges, and its wings are like all crumpled and wet. And as the wings dry, they unfold, and the butterfly begins to learn to use its new wings, and eventually it learns to fly. So it's amazing to see the transformation of an insect, which basically resembles a worm, into a beautiful flying creature. But you know, it's also beautiful to see how God transforms a selfish, sinful person into a beautiful child of God who reflects his image. Now, our passage today is going to center on the transfiguration of Jesus. However, Matthew tells the story in a way that also points to the transformation of Jesus' disciples, and Matthew being one of them. Transformation is a process, and we see in the text a basic outline of how transformation happens. And if you're following along in your insert or in your e-bulletin, here's our outline for today. First of all, we set our mind on the things of God. And then we spend time in God's presence. And eventually we emerge to step out in faith. Now, do you see the parallel to the butterfly? The caterpillar, set our minds on things of God. That's like eating lots of leaves, preparing for what's to come. Spending time in God's presence. That's where we're shut in with God. And then eventually we emerge and we begin to step out in faith. So let's take these one at a time. First of all, set your mind on the things of God. Many of our messages in this series, Live Like Jesus, have focused on aligning ourselves with God, his character and his purpose. So living like Jesus means becoming more like Jesus. And as we read about Jesus, the more we realize that Jesus is not like us, or at least not like how we are in our human nature. He thinks differently, and thus he also acts differently. And that should clue us into that transformation for us is going to mean thinking and acting differently. So let's see if we can begin to catch Jesus' train of thought. We are in Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Now, if any of us hears a friend talking about dying, we immediately become concerned, right? That's just normal, right? If you take all of the Gospels together, it seems apparent that, first of all, there was some threats to Jesus' ministry and perhaps even some threats to his life early on. He talks about persecution in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's reasonable to think that he's talking from experience. He's experiencing that persecution. And it would explain why the crowds were following him to remote places. Perhaps those were the only safe places for him to teach and preach. Maybe Peter thought that Jesus was, cracking under the pressure of it all. That would be reasonable. But Jesus informs Peter that his suggestion is really from the devil. Wow. I wonder if Peter, or anyone else for that matter, saw that one coming. Just a few verses ago, Peter was the one making the divine confession that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. But Jesus had a different perspective. He had different thoughts, right? So here's the first fill in the blank. First of all, know the source of your thoughts. Know the source of your thoughts. I know that's a strange idea for some people, but just stick with me for a minute. Did you know that not every thought that pops into your head is really yours. Thoughts can have different sources. People can be manipulated by mental suggestion. I'm not that good, or I would demonstrate for you, but causing people to think in a certain way and then think that they thought of it. That's what mental suggestion is. For example, did you know that there are subliminal messages in advertising? Ways that things are structured, things that flash across the screen that are try to make you think that you thought of something. Magicians. Anybody ever tried learning magic or the art of illusion? The whole idea is to distract people. Get them looking one direction while you're doing something another direction. And then this is a much darker thing. Don't mess with this. But there are those who practice psychic projection as well. If our minds are vulnerable to people who would try to make us think in ways that we might not otherwise think, imagine the mischief that our spiritual enemy has attempted. Peter thinks he's having another brilliant thought, but Jesus informs him that what he's saying is just another trick of the devil. Why? Because Jesus is hearing from God that his path leads to the cross, and Peter is trying to sway him from that direction. Have you ever tried to tell someone something and you had no idea how what you are saying is actually impacting the person that you're saying it to? Well, that's what's happening right now with Jesus and Peter. Let me give you an example. So I'm preparing this message, and Carrie and I are in the middle of a workshop, and I had a perfect illustration. So in one of the workshops at the conference last week, they were playing a game where a question was put up on a screen. This was all about cross-cultural things. And the participants who came from, as Carrie said, from like at least 19 different nations, the idea was, as the question comes up on the screen, you are supposed to move to one side of the room or the other, depending on how you would answer that question according to your home culture. So one question was this: in your culture, if you disagree with a leader, how would you express that? And on one side of the room are those who would go to the leader and confront that leader, and on the other side of the room are those who would simply keep the matter entirely to themselves. And of course, we had a lot of Asians in the room. Most of the Asians moved to the side of the room that was non-confrontational. However, there were two of them that were standing a little closer to the middle. And then the group that is over here begins to try to persuade the two that are closer to the middle. No, this is our culture. You're supposed to be over here with us. And to one of the participants, whom we had lunch with afterward, that whole experience served to illustrate the pressure that she felt as an Asian to conform to the demands of her culture. To her, the group was saying, you're not allowed to have your own opinion. Peter probably thought that he was looking out for Jesus as his friend and was protecting him. However, Jesus had a different perspective on what Peter was saying. Jesus understood it as the enemy trying to distract him and divert him from his course of obedience to God. In other words, the devil was using Peter to get to Jesus. Now, Peter probably thought, well, that was an okay thought, wasn't it? Maybe, but it wasn't from God. You see, God can only be the source of good things. Paul writes in Philippians 4:8, "Now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true, what is honorable, what is right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. What about you? Have you ever entertained a thought just to realize later that that thought was taking you down a wrong path? You know, some thoughts are clearly wrong, and we try to avoid those, right? But some thoughts seem like they're just fine until we realize that they're not. And you know, good thoughts are not just thoughts that seem good, but they are the thoughts that come from a good place and they lead to a good result. You know, Carrie and I were teaching about this last week in the workshop. We were teaching about being emotionally mature, emotionally healthy. And part of being emotionally healthy is knowing yourself, knowing what you're thinking and feeling, and eventually, as you become more mature, knowing and understanding where those thoughts are coming from and where they are leading to. You know, all of our thoughts and feelings, well, we say there's no such thing as an unexpressed emotion, right? They need to be expressed somehow, but you know, many or most of those thoughts simply need to be surrendered to God to find out what's from Him and what's just a distraction. And all of that discernment process is examining not just where our thoughts and feelings come from, but where they are taking us. And that's the next fill in the blank. Consider the consequence of your thoughts. Let's pick up in verse 24. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. You know, all living organisms are believed to have a self-preservation instinct. Now, I did a little research on this, and this theory has not been tested in all living things, but it can be generally observed that all living things have mechanisms to ensure their own survival and to defend against threats. And of course, humans are no different. You realize that if a person does not have a self-preservation instinct, we consider that a psychological disorder. So why would Jesus tell his followers to deny themselves and to take it even further, to forfeit their lives if necessary? Well, because there's another kind of life that is greater than our natural lives. Do you know that giving in to threats in order to save your natural life, well, that kills your spirit. But laying down your life in a non-threatening way, that causes your spirit to flourish. And the way this passage is recorded in Matthew's narrative, it would seem that Jesus said this before anyone else knew what was going to happen. Have you ever thought about this? What do you think the disciples thought he meant when he said, "Take up your cross," before he went to the cross? You know, crucifixions were common in that day. There were literally thousands of criminals and insurrectionists who were crucified over the time of the ministry of Jesus. Would Jesus' disciples have understood his words as, hey, see those guys on the cross up there? Be ready to join them. So then, how would they have understood him saying, follow me? You know, I'm sure that these words took on very powerful meaning after the resurrection. The disciples suddenly realized that Jesus had told them all along exactly what was going to happen. And knowing that life is more than just our lifetime, and that God already knows the future, should cause us to want to align our thoughts with God, who already knows. Did you know you can challenge your defensive thoughts by reflecting on eternity? You know, we are all going to stand before God one day and give account. If not for our thoughts, at least for our words and actions. But there is this one disturbing verse in Matthew 12:36. Jesus said, "And I tell you this, you must give account on judgment day for every idle word you speak." That should radically change the way we think and speak, because our thoughts and our words have eternal implications. You know, those thoughts have consequences. Every thought that you have is leading you somewhere. Do you really want to go where your thoughts are taking you? Is your mindset drawing you closer to God? So that's the first part. Let's transition to spending time in God's presence. Now we're in Matthew chapter 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. I imagine they were probably singing the song we opened with this morning. Oh, you're beautiful. Right? And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." I don't know, Peter, where are you going to sleep? You know, when it says in the Bible that Jesus was transfigured, now there's a word you don't see outside of the Bible. What do you think that means? It means he literally changed in form and appearance. Just like we sang. Light was emanating from his face. His clothes became opaque because the light is shining through the fabric from the inside out. He turned into a heavenly being whose substance is made of light. Oh, and by the way, the word that's translated transfigured, you know what that word is in the Greek? Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. So when Paul says that we are transformed into his image, it should call this story to mind. 2 Corinthians 3:18, Paul says, "So our faces are not covered. They show the bright glory of the Lord, as the Lord's Spirit makes us more and more like our glorious Lord." Wow. Talk about transformation. You know, it just makes me want to look into the face of Jesus until my face shines like his. And that's the next fill in the blank. See Jesus as he is. See Jesus as he is. Picking up in verse 5. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise, have no fear." And when they lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. You know, Peter made the bold confession that Jesus is the Son of God, but now they are seeing it with their own eyes. They see Jesus in his glorious eternal form. Hadn't Jesus just said, "Some of you will not taste death until they see me in my kingdom"? Guess what? This is it. They see him surrounded by the clouds, just as Daniel did in his vision. Daniel 7:13, this is the Message Bible. Daniel writes, "My dream continued. I saw a human form, the Son of Man, arriving in a whirl of clouds. And he came to the Old One, the Ancient of Days, and was presented to him." So the disciples saw Jesus in this glorious form, and guess what happened? Face plant. You ever been there? One of the most vivid memories I have from my Bible school days in my 20s is the smell of the carpet, because I spent a lot of time on the carpet. If only we could just spend time in his presence. You know, if only we could behold his glory, not just to imagine it, but to behold it, to press in until the glory reflects off of our faces. And this is just the most beautiful phrase. I love what the text says. The text says, "And when they got up, they only saw Jesus." Wow, that'll preach. What a profound statement. You know, I want to stay on my face in his presence until I can get up and only see Jesus. Yes, we fall on our faces because we're terrified of the truth. We fall down because we are overwhelmed in his glory. You know, that was the whole thing during the charismatic movement. Why do people fall down? Because they can't stand up. It takes everything in us, putting aside that self-preservation instinct, to stay in his presence, to stay in that place of humility. But when we get up, the good news is we only see Jesus. But the story isn't over. You know, Jesus does a little debrief with his disciples on the way down the mountain, and that's our next fill in the blank. Ask questions until you understand. You want to spend time in God's presence? You're saying, what am I going to do in God's presence? I'll tell you what you do. After you finally get up and you only see Jesus, that's the time to ask questions. Picking up in verse 9. "And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.'" So the disciples asked him, "So then why did the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" And he answered, "Elijah does come and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. But they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands." And then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Now, the disciples had just had a close encounter of the very first kind. And Jesus turns to them on the way down the mountain and says, "Oh, by the way, guys, what you just witnessed is classified until further notice." And then the disciples got an idea, and they're like, "Okay, if we're not going to be allowed to talk about this, we just need you to answer one question first." You see, Elijah was supposed to appear and announce your coming, but we just saw Elijah with you on the mountaintop in an obscure place. How is that announcing your coming? Did you know it's okay to ask God questions? Seriously. God does not mind when we ask him questions that are on our minds and on our hearts. You know, when we were 3-year-olds, we all asked a lot of questions. That's what 3-year-olds do. Why is this like this? Why does it do that? What is this? If your parents were like mine, they probably got tired of it. And they said something like, "Stop asking so many questions." You know, God doesn't say that. You can never ask God too many questions. However, there are some questions for which God will say, "You know what? You're not ready to hear the answer." But he will never tell you to stop asking. You know, Jesus told the disciples that his coming was announced. It was announced by John the Baptist, who, by the way, kind of dressed like and looked like Elijah. And did you know that where John was baptizing was just a stone's throw away from where Elijah ascended into heaven and the place he was supposedly coming back to? So those who were looking for a sign, well, they could have connected the dots, except they didn't. They assumed they already knew, and so they didn't ask. You know, the ones to whom God reveals himself are the ones who spend time with him. And so let's talk about the third section. Step out in faith. You know, in the illustration of the caterpillar and the butterfly, the transformation process concludes with the butterfly emerging from the chrysalis. However, its wings are still wet and crumpled, and the butterfly will need to stretch its wings before it can use them. You could say that the transformation is not actually complete until the butterfly actually flies. Did you know that Christian transformation is not complete until we actually begin to do the things that Jesus did? When we begin thinking like Jesus, and then we start to look like Jesus, guess what? You're not done until you begin to act like Jesus. Now, you may think that acting like Jesus means doing miracles and casting out demons. You're not wrong, but most people don't start there. See, we start by stretching our wings. Let's begin by just simply bringing Jesus into the situation. And that's your next fill in the blank. Guide people to Jesus. Simply bring Jesus into the situation. What do I mean? Well, there's an incident that happens as they come down the mountain. Let's read about it. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, "Lord, have mercy on your son." Or have mercy on my son. Sorry. For he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. And Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. So isn't that the way it goes? You know, you have a mountaintop experience, very literally. You have a powerful encounter with Jesus Christ that makes you feel like just absolutely anything is possible. We had that report from some who attended the conference. It was a mountaintop experience. And then you come back down the mountain, back to reality, back to where there are real life and death problems, and you suddenly realize that everything you experienced on the mountain, that was all God. And me, by myself, I got nothing. Unless God shows up, I have nothing to give. That's what the disciples were experiencing. Unfortunately, that is when Jesus showed up. Jesus' first words were for the disciples. "How long am I going to have to do everything for you?" That's not sarcasm, that's a real question. How long am I going to have to do everything for you? Jesus knows that his time on earth is limited. And they're going to have to learn to fly by the time he does. And Jesus is clearly trying to get the disciples to a place where they are ready to complete his ministry and his mission. Picking up in verse 25. "I have spoken of these matters in figures of speech, but soon I will..." This is John 16:25. "I have spoken of these matters in figures of speech, but soon I will stop speaking figuratively and will tell you plainly all about the Father. Then you will ask in my name. And I'm not saying I'll ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you dearly because you love me and believe that I came from God." That's where Jesus is trying to get the disciples to. But the disciples aren't there yet. And honestly, many times neither are we. Do you know what you can always do, even when you don't feel like you know what to do? You can simply guide people to Jesus. Do you know what Jesus said to them? He said, "Bring him to me." That's something you can always do. Bring them to Jesus. Do you know how many times as a pastor people ask me questions or they ask me for advice about situations, and I'm sitting there trying to look smart, thinking to myself, I would like to know the answer to that too. I have no idea. I may look like I know what I'm doing, but there are a lot of times when deep inside I'm like, help. But I've learned enough to know that even when I don't know what to do, I can still guide people to the one who does. Let's pray. I don't know what to do, but Jesus knows. Can we ask him together? And so we prayed. Now what? Well, now we listen. We talk through what we know, and we expect the Holy Spirit to guide us. We do what we know to do while we wait for guidance on the part that we don't know. And if things don't go the way they should, Well, we talked to Jesus about that too. And this is the point that I'm making. Your next fill in the blank. Use the faith that you have. You want to step out in faith? Start somewhere. Use the faith that you have. Verse 19, but the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why couldn't we cast it out? And then he said to them, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. And nothing will be impossible for you. I think we often misinterpret this passage. See, the disciples came and they said, why couldn't we do it? And Jesus said, because of your little faith. Now, we take Jesus' answer to be condemning, but it's not. It's just the facts. You're not there yet, right? You can't run before you can walk. You know, other accounts of this story say that Jesus said, well, prayer and fasting are needed. That's kind of like Jesus saying, if you're going to run a race, you need an exercise regimen. Now, that's not a slam on the disciples. Far from it. Jesus is just letting them know what is possible and what it takes to get there. You know, you guys got just a teeny tiny amount of faith, like a mustard seed. But you realize that even a mustard seed grows into a huge plant. Don't underestimate that mustard seed. You will get there, but you have some growing to do. So what do? You start with the faith you have. You tried doing miracles and it didn't work. Guess what, guys? Do you remember? You helped distribute loaves and fish to an entire crowd. Guess what? You got to participate in a miracle. Yeah, that's right. You did that. You know, you tried to cast out a demon and it didn't work. But you can bring a boy to Jesus and the demon leaves. Guess what? You just had your first lesson in casting out demons. Bring him to Jesus. Why do we always think that we have to do things perfectly the first time we try something? You know, when a butterfly comes out and it has its wings, but it just sits there practicing for a while, you know? The flapping motion. Let's see how this works. I got to make sure these things work before I'm going to jump off this twig, right? You got to find out what it feels like before you're ready to go airborne. You know, that's how it is with transformation. It's a process. Your mind is not instantly renewed the moment you accept Jesus. At least that wasn't my experience. The process of renewing your mind takes time. In my experience, a lot of time. Oh, and by the way, you're never really completely done. It lasts over your entire lifetime. That time you spend in God's presence, you realize that's not a one-time deal. You know, we all know people who are always going to the altar, and you know, sometimes we get impatient. We see that person go to the altar again, and it's like, okay, what is it now? You know, the truth is that if we were all that spiritual, we would all be at the altar every Sunday. Because that's the process of transformation. You can never get enough of God's presence. You know, that thing about walking by faith, that takes practice. You know, they say that if you help a butterfly out of its chrysalis, you're going to kill it. It needs that struggle of pushing back the walls of its chamber to strengthen its wings to fly. And you would be inadvertently depriving it of what it needs to survive. What if we saw our struggles as a necessary exercise of our faith? What if we read Jesus' remarks of having little faith, not as a discouragement, but as a challenge? What if we understood taking up our cross not just as embracing Christ's suffering, but also daily embracing the process of transformation? Pat, whoever's coming, would you guys come? We're going to close with communion today. So Joan and whoever's passing out communion. Here's some questions for reflection while they do that. When you think about spiritual transformation, do you imagine it happening in a moment or over a lifetime? Do you think about that time you first came to Christ, or about your life with Christ now? What if it's not an either or? What if it's both? And your future as well? Question number 2. Have you had a spiritual encounter with God? Have you witnessed the brilliance of Christ's light shining in your life? Have you ever spent time on your face just soaking in the glory of His presence? And have you stayed there until you only see Jesus? Question number 3. If you compare your spiritual transformation to that of a butterfly, where are you in the process? Are you hungry to learn all that you can about God? That's the caterpillar stage. Are you hidden away in God's presence while it feels like everything inside is just breaking down? Yeah, that's the chrysalis phase. Or are you stretching your wings of faith and learning to fly? By the way, I don't think that process is just linear. I think it's cyclical. Let's reflect on these things as we prepare to partake of the Lord's Supper.